On the 4th of July, 1828, the ceremonial first stone of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was laid. 24 years later, the railroad had successfully connected Baltimore, Maryland, and Wheeling, Virginia, with its first line, a distance of 379 miles. At the time, no one could have foreseen that the impact of the railroad would reach far beyond the exploration of new land and exchange of goods. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was vitally important in the Civil War, because as the first railroad in America, it provided an easy means for the transportation of troops, weapons, and goods. Over its telegraph line, the B&O also provided a method for different parts of an army to exchange information rapidly. Both the Union and the Confederacy were unfamiliar with the tactics of using a railroad for military advantage, so over the course of many mistakes and encounters along the railroad line, they explored the new form of warfare. The Pratt Street riot of April 19, 1861, is commonly recognized as the first bloodshed of the Civil War. Because of Confederate riots in South Carolina, President Lincoln called for troops to be sent to Washington, D.C. to build an army. Soldiers in Massachusetts traveled by rail to Baltimore, where they had to transfer from the PW&B Railroad to the B&O. An important fact about railroads at the time, especially in Baltimore, is that different lines did not meet in large terminals as they do today. There was a gap of almost 2 miles between the stations of the PW&B and the B&O.
They couldn't move this many troops by horse and carriage, so they marched across town. On the second day of this movement, the Southern sympathizers in Baltimore couldn't take it anymore.
They threw rocks at the troops, and then a riot began, and the Southern sympathizers opened fire. Around 15 volunteer soldiers were killed. Few troops reached Washington before the riot broke out, so the Union Army was still very weak. Word got out to Benjamin Butler, a Union general, who then found a route to D.C. that used a ferry boat to get to Annapolis, and then the B&O's Washington branch to complete the journey, avoiding Baltimore altogether. Once the rest of the troops arrived, D.C. was protected and ready for any encounter with the Confederates. For the first few decades of its existence, the B&O was purely a commercial entity that transported people and aided in the exchange of goods. It had no ties with the government. In the months preceding the Civil War, the railroad's location below the Mason-Dixon line proved to be an issue because the B&O's president, John Garrett, wanted the railroad to remain a neutral entity. Previously, the U.S. had used the railroad for military purposes, and Confederates were unhappy with this. So to quiet them, Garrett had said that, "It is a southern line, and if ever necessity should require, which heaven forbid, it will prove the great bulwark of the border, and a sure agency for home defense." Despite these comments, he still wished to remain neutral, and did so, at least for a little while. In the early months of 1861, Colonel Stonewall Jackson of Virginia noticed that northern railroads, such as the B&O, were significantly better than railroads in the Deep South. He thought that by stealing from the B&O, he would level the playing field. In April of 1861, Jackson and some Virginian soldiers took control of 40 miles of B&O track. He later stationed a crew at each end of the captured track, and simultaneously, each crew severed the line to prevent any more railroad cars from entering or exiting the 40-mile stretch. At that time, 56 locomotives and around 380 cars owned by the B&O were trapped on that section of track. Jackson had successfully stolen them for the Confederacy's use, achieving his goal. After this encounter with Jackson and the Confederate Army, Garrett gave up on neutrality and swore his loyalty to the Union. It was now a known fact that the B&O would help the Union Army in any way it could, so the Confederacy's only logical option was to make the railroad unfit for use. The question then was, how were they going to do that, which sparked the Confederacy's exploration of this new form of warfare. They decided that the easiest way to incapacitate the railroad was to take it by force and destroy it. In May of 1861, 5,000 volunteer Confederate troops gathered at Grafton, a town in northwest Virginia, ready to do just that. The people of northwest Virginia became concerned with the presence of these troops, because northwest Virginia, which later became the state of West Virginia, supported the Union. Within the next few weeks, Major General McClellan set up outposts along the Ohio River to ease the fears of the people. Under the belief that these outposts were a sign that his army would soon encounter McClellan's army on the battlefield, Porterfield, the commander of the Confederate troops, ordered his men to destroy bridges on the B&O as far west as they could to prevent McClellan from advancing quickly. McClellan ordered his men to proceed from the west to Grafton, using the B&O as transportation and fixing as many damaged bridges as they could while pushing Porterfield's army back. These advancements were enough to force Porterfield to retreat to Philippi, 16 miles south of the B&O. Shortly after, McClellan took over Grafton. Soon after that, he pushed the Confederates out of Philippi, leaving them almost 100 miles away from the B&O. Without the aid of the B&O, McClellan's troops would not have been able to attack the Confederates as quickly or efficiently. One of the biggest disadvantages of Porterfield's army was that it did not have a railroad at its disposal, so all troop movement had to be done by foot and horse. Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general, was very disappointed with Porterfield's performance in the encounters with McClellan's army and replaced him with General Garnett, who was told that his duty was to prevent the Union forces from gaining any further ground in Virginia and attack the B&O Railroad. Lee emphasized, "The rupture of the railroad would be worth an army to us." He was one of the first Confederate leaders to acknowledge the importance of the B&O to the Union. Following Porterfield's replacement, McClellan attacked the Confederates in their new encampments at Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill. They fled yet again, and this time the Union wasn't as lucky, because Garnett's army fled directly toward the B&O at Oakland, Maryland. McClellan planned to gather his troops, transport them to Oakland on the B&O, and stop the Confederates from harming the railroad, and he sent a telegram along the B&O to arrange for this. Since the B&O's telegraph line was still working out the kinks of rapid information exchange, the telegram was delayed for almost a whole day. John Garrett was ashamed to learn of this failure on his railroad's behalf, for it ultimately stopped McClellan's counterattack and allowed Garnett's army to take over Oakland. As a part of the exploration into this new warfare, he swore to try his hardest to not mess up again. Never did John Garrett get a bigger chance to redeem himself than the Union troop movement to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Before that, the Confederates under the leadership of General Bragg encountered Major General Rosecrans's Union Army in the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863.
What happened is that there was a lot of confusion because of lack of communications, and the Union troops were allowed to escape back into Chattanooga.
The Confederates followed and besieged the city in hopes that they could force a surrender without another battle. Rosecrans calculated that his army could only survive for 10 more days in Chattanooga and notified the head of the War Department, Edwin Stanton, of this, who then sought to put together a plan for reinforcement as quickly as possible. The fastest way at that time to move troops, weapons, ammunition, and food from Washington, D.C. to Chattanooga, Tennessee was the railroad. The B&O Railroad was known to be very reliable, as it had been used over the past few decades in the exchange of coal and freight. John Garrett, president of the B&O, was selected to direct the troop movement to Chattanooga for these reasons and for his previous cooperation with the Union Army. Over the course of 11.5 days, over 20,000 troops, ammunition, weapons, and supplies departed Washington on B&O trains, utilized almost 10 different railroads, and successfully reached Chattanooga, fortifying the city thanks to Garrett, Stanton, and other officials. The corridor to Atlanta, the industrial center of the South, had been guarded prior to the Battle of Chattanooga, but after the Confederates lost, Bragg retreated to the city, leaving the corridor wide open. Rosecrans and his army seized this opportunity and followed them, and after surprising the Confederates in a military encounter, the Union took over Atlanta, significantly weakening Bragg's army. Many Union victories followed over the course of the next year or so, leading the Confederates to surrender. However, the first domino of this chain of victories, Chattanooga, would not have fallen if it were not for the assistance of John Garrett and the B&O Railroad. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was one of the Union's biggest assets during the Civil War. The rapid transport of troops, weapons, and goods proved to be very useful to an army, as in the Battle of Chattanooga. The B&O's previous experience in the exchange of coal and freight made them a reliable choice for the Union Army. All future wars fought with railroads would be easier because of this preliminary exploration, because there would be less trial and error, as in the battles of Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill. If the B&O had not assisted the Union as much as it did, the Union Army may have lost the war, but there is no need to linger on that point, because the B&O helped them well enough that they were able to win.